All right. Good morning, everyone. Lance Tarchioni back with you here on Ask the Agronomist this morning. Appreciate everybody joining in. A little bit of a foggy, damp morning over here in Western Illinois. Good night to get a little bit of moisture back in your 8.9% soybeans, which would be very welcome. Been how long has it been since it rained, Adam? Meaningfully,
a couple months.
Well, I don't think it's been quite that long, but it's
been
but
last big rain. Yeah,
2 weeks or more,
2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah. So we've been on quite a run here with harvest. Yields are doing well, so there's a good amount of grain to move out of the field. But the only thing that has stopped you has been breakdowns and mechanical issues, and maybe crops that weren't as dry as you wanted them to be. We have not really had any weather delays to speak of through this harvest, and who knows how long that will continue. But with my old stuff, we need a rainy day about every 4 days just so I can fix the stuff that's broke. We're going to have to take a day off here and just make repairs instead of harvesting if this keeps up. But been a very fast harvest. And a tremendous amount of harvest has been completed in some areas. There's a lot left to go. We're going to talk a lot today about what we're seeing with that harvest. Things that are good, things that are bad, things that are surprising. We're going to talk a little bit about the infamous phantom yield loss, which if you pulled into a field of corn at 25% and it was making 250, and you come back 3 weeks later when it's 17% and it's making 220. And you want to know where that 30 bushel went, that's not phantom yield loss, but phantom yield loss could be a component of those missing bushels. We're going to talk about the other things that are part of those missing bushels. We'll talk a lot about diseases as it relates to yield. We'll talk about weather as it relates to yield. And as always here on Ask the Agronomist, we hope to answer your questions. So if you're logged in to the live chat, Adam is here today with me. Always good to have Adam here to help out, man in the chat, and he will be passing your questions that you chat in to me. We can talk about whatever's on your mind. If you've been seeing things in your fields that either surprise or disappoint or excite you, and you want to talk about that, please feel free to chat them in. I would say it's been a little bit difficult in my 9-county area to get, a perfect firm grasp on, how good or how bad of a year we're having from a yield standpoint. I would say generally yields have been good to very good. I would say generally yields have been better than expected if your expectations were realistic. But every now and then, I do run into a little pocket here or there where somebody's harvesting some 220, 230 corn, and they thought they had the same weather that somebody who's harvesting 260, 270 corn, and they want to know what's up with that. We've also seen a lot of variability in bean yields. I'd say as a percentage, I see more variability in bean yields than I do in corn yields. We've had some 100 bushel beans in plots. We've had the occasional field making 90. We've also had the occasional field making in the 50s. And in some areas, there's been quite a few beans in I'd say the upper 60s. Not bad, but not the kind of 75, 80 bushel field averages that we've become accustomed to in recent years. It's really easy to get used to 80 bushel soybeans. I did see a very interesting, and shout out to Jordan Zimmer, who's one of our faithful listeners, a very good dealer for us. Does a lot of on-farm trials, and he put out a planting date study where they had 3 planting dates on one particular variety, and it was just a perfect stair step. Jordan, if you made that data up, it would look exactly like your data looks. There was as I recall, about maybe a 7 or 8 bushel decrease for each delay in planting from mid-April to mid-May. He had 3 dates, and it just stair stepped right on down. And his early planted beans were really good. His middle planting date were okay, and his later in May planting date, actually by today's standards, would have been kind of disappointing. So as you're trying to make sense of your soybean yields, look at your planting date, look at the maturity of your soybean, look at the weather patterns that you experienced, and how healthy were those beans. And we're going to talk about a lot of disease stuff today, because a combination of of weather and disease really explains most of the yield differences that we're seeing in both of our crops. A lot of times the weather is the driving force behind the disease. So, there's a reason Dr. Belo puts weather at the top of the list when it comes to determining yield, because not only does moisture have a huge bearing on yield potential, the stress caused by too much or too little moisture influences diseases, which have a big impact on yield as well. So let's start with what we're seeing in soybeans. So, I would say whether your beans are in the low 90s and you're tickled to death, or they're in the upper 50s and you're pissed, that's kind of the range that we've had. And I would start with weather. So if you're in an area that received very little rainfall in late July, very little rainfall in August, almost all of us caught some nice rains in September, but they tended to be after Labor Day, and a lot of soybeans were already starting to turn. And if the first rain you got on your soybeans after, the middle of July was September 10th, and they were already starting to turn, that moisture really didn't do any good. Now, if your soybeans were still grass green when you got those September rains, that certainly helped. However, I would say if your soybeans were grass green on September 10th, that means one of two things. Either they were late planted or they're full season beans. And both of those categories had been severely stressed and injured and hurt and damaged by the dry weather we were going through in August. So those September rains absolutely did help those late planted full season beans. But they're not going to help them enough to make them better than the early planted, earlier season beans. And we're seeing a little bit of a unique trend in our trials this year. Generally speaking, if you look at soybean maturity and yield, you plot out yield, you plot out maturity, and say this is a 2.5 and this is a 4.0. Generally speaking, that's kind of the trend that you see. Now, you can change the slope of that line. Some years it's pretty flat, some years it's very steep, but there's generally always an up to the right movement. This year, I think we're going to see a trend where in many areas, that's going to be the line. Now, obviously, lines are never straight, but we have data like that, and then a statistician plots the straight line through the crazy data. But that straight line is going to dip down. And the reason for that is rainfall or lack thereof. So if your summer was like mine, and it basically just kept getting drier and drier and drier and drier as it went along, the earlier your bean was in maturity and the earlier it was planted means the further along it was on any given calendar date. And because we didn't get a lot of moisture in August in some areas, you were better off to be further ahead. And so that early bean that was planted early was a lot closer to maturity, made more use of the July moisture that didn't really do as much for the later planted fuller season bean that really needed that August and early September moisture that we didn't get. So I think in some areas, it's going to be really tough to beat an early planted early bean. And those are the first beans that get harvested, right? So I have a little bit of a concern that some people have been out and they've cut their early planted early beans. and they were satisfied with the yield. Maybe not ecstatic, but satisfied. Maybe not as good as the last couple of years, but pretty good. They may have cut their best beans already, and as they get into their fuller season and later planted beans, that yield may tail off a little bit. Now, I don't know that plots indicate that yields will get bad. I've recently seen some harvested plots that I walked prior to harvest recently, and when I was walking those plots, I was scared of how disappointed somebody was going to be in those yields. And those beans were averaged in the mid 70s. They were a lot better than I would have gauged them based on the amount of disease and pod abortion and seed abortion that we were seeing in those plants walking those plots. So I'm hopeful that management, genetics, and other things will help these beans pull through some less than ideal weather. But the other thing we're seeing is places that have had a lot of rain. There are parts of our geography, and Adam's over here nodding his head. He's got some of those areas. He's seen yields coming from some of those areas. Places that had ample rainfall in July, August, early September. We're seeing those 90 plus bushel soybean yields, even field averages in the low 90s. We've had some hundreds in some plots. There was more SDS showing up in some of those areas, but it's kind of and we talk about SDS being a high yield environment disease. And there are fields that had pretty bad SDS that are better than fields that had no SDS, but had no rain either. And so, yes, the field with SDS would have been better had it not had it. But in some cases, the dry weather that prevented SDS from showing up in other geographies hurt yield more than the disease did. Now, SDS is not the only soybean disease, and the main disease we were actually looking at on soybeans when we did our walk plot tour about a week and a half ago was actually a class of diseases that we refer to as the diaporthy complex. And pod and stem blight, which you've heard of, you may not be familiar with the term diaporthy. Pod and stem blight you've heard of. Cercospora, maybe you've heard of, which causes purple seed stain. There's a disease called zone lines, which that was actually one of the most prevalent diseases that we saw. It gets confused with charcoal rot and anthracnose, which you can also find. We were seeing brown stem rot. We were seeing sudden death. It was just a whole, hodgepodge of diseases, a lot of them related to drought stress during seed fill. When we look at beans to the south, so my colleague Chris Carlisle had, I believe, actually achieved the highest bean yield he's ever had at Auburn, at his plot site there at Auburn. That was one of the locations we had beans over 100 bushel. I think he had multiple beans go over 100 bushel at that site, and did not see anything but big, fat, healthy pods, when we were looking at those beans. So you didn't see as much disease. You didn't see as much seed abortion. You weren't looking at a 4-bean pod that had aborted down to 2.5 beans. And you weren't looking at a 3-bean pod that had 1 bean in it. And you weren't looking at flat pods. You had just big clusters at the top of full, plump, pods, just exactly like you'd like to see, like you would expect to see in beans that are making 100 bushel. And when we went on our tour, we started with the best beans. So the first plot we looked at is the one that had stuff going over 100 a few days later when I got harvested. And then we went down from there. And so we started at a site where beans were over 100. We ended up at sites where beans were in the upper 60s and low 70s. And there's a pretty dramatic difference. If you can, you don't often get the chance to do this on your farm, to walk into a field of 100 bushel beans and then walk into a field of 60 bushel beans. But if you do that side by side or back to back, you can really tell. Now, I can't tell you that this was going to be 100, this was going to be 60, but I can tell you this is a lot better than that. And you can see those differences. And it's a lot of these diseases, a little bit bit of sudden death, a little bit of brown stem rot. I forgot to put white mold on here. In some areas, we've actually seen, and it tends to be more as you go north, more white mold this year. But this diaporthy complex, if you want to Google that, you can see some pictures. Look for a disease called zone lines, and when you're splitting, so we split stems to look at BSR and sudden death earlier in the season. Well, at harvest time, when you're going through that field and you're cutting 85 bushel soybeans and you're feeling pretty good, and they've got that kind of that pretty, as pretty as beans can get look to them. And then you pull into that spot that's kind of dingy looking and dark gray. And you can just tell from the combine seat that it's mostly stems, not a lot of pods there.
Tons of dust.
It's really dusty and they're dark, kind of sooty looking, and just an area there. You can see there's something different about it. That's not sudden death. That is some of this other stuff. And I think if you dig up those roots, and you can really probably just pop them out of the ground because there aren't many roots there. But if you dig up those plants and look at the roots are completely decayed and disintegrated off of those plants. And this diaporthy complex, some of the diseases that are part of that, to me, is kind of analogous to crown rot in corn. And they impact the root health of the soybean plant. And the roots are sick and dying in August in a drought. So does that sound familiar from when we've talked about crown rot before? So it's not the same pathogens, it's not the same diseases, it's not the same, but it does the same thing to the plant. The plant is under stress. It has a disease in its roots that thrives on plants under stress. The worse the disease gets, the sicker the roots get, and the more decayed they get, and the more stress the plant's under, and it just snowballs. And eventually the plant just dies. And what you end up with for yield is whatever yield was there when the bean was 60% done growing. And the reason they're dark and sooty and nasty looking is because they've been dead residue for a long time standing in your field. And every fungi in the world is starting to decompose that residue. So a lot going on there. You can find, if you send one of those plants into the lab, you'll get a list of stuff as you can fill out a piece of paper with what the lab could find on those beans. And you're left to decipher, well, I wonder which one killed them, or I wonder which one was there first, or I wonder which one did the damage, or I sprayed fungicide on this. Why are any of these things there? Those thoughts all go through your head. But, if you've got little pockets in fields, where your beans are, making 40, no big deal. But if you pull into a field where the little pockets cover 75% of the field, that's going to be disappointing. And I think we will potentially have some of those disappointments, especially as we work our way through harvest and get into some of our later planted fuller season beans in areas that were dry. There's going to be some good beans out there. I don't know that everybody will be up to their, personal standards or their goal for their soybean yields. Last year we set a record for average bean yields in the state of Illinois. They actually recently revised last year's yield numbers on soybeans even to higher than they thought they were previously. So we had a tremendously good bean year last year. This year to me is going to be a little more average by today's standards on soybeans. Wasn't that long ago that, people thought 70 bushel beans were awesome. And so if you were in the high 60s, that wasn't really a bad place to be. But, you get a taste of some 85 bushel field averages and you're seeing 100 and something popping up on your yield monitor frequently going across the field. And then you end up with a 67 field average. That's not a terribly good feeling. So the other thing I would say, and we try not to make Ask the Agronomist a commercial or a sales pitch, so that is not what this is. But we do call a spade here on Ask the Agronomist, and we are seeing a nice separation between trait platforms as well. So I'm not saying that the reason your beans are disappointing is because of the kind of bean you planted, but the kind of bean you plant does influence your overall yield potential. Now, I would say that the ranking for me of yield determining things in soybeans would be weather. I'm going to say maturity, maybe number 2. Planting date, number 3. Diseases, and I could move diseases up to number 2 probably in some situations, but planting date and maturity are having a function of how much disease is there. So you could change the order on those 3 if you wanted to. I'm going to say management's going to come in here somewhere not as high up the list as you would like it to be, and then I'm going to say genetics. And our breeders would not like me putting genetics last on the list, but in reality, genetics matter, but they don't matter as much as weather. And they don't matter this year, maybe in some cases, even as much as maturity. Hell, we got a 2.7 is blowing everything away in our plots. Now, it's a damn good 2.7, but I don't care how good a 2.7 is. It shouldn't be beating a 4.0, but it's doing it pretty regularly. Planting date's going to be big because it influences maturity. Diseases, can trump a lot of things, because if your plant dies prematurely, it doesn't matter how excellent the genetics were once it's dead. And if the genetics weren't able to keep it alive longer, you're not going to see the benefit of the genetics. Our management, plays into here, so you could say that, well, yeah, but I planted early. That's my management. So move management up the list. Well, you could do that. You could argue all these. And then down here, you've got genetics, and there's not a bean on the market today that can't yield 100 bushel per acre if all this up here is perfect. But there are differences, and those differences are not probably as dramatic as the differences that are caused by some of these other factors. But that doesn't mean they're not real, and it doesn't mean it doesn't influence your bottom line.
You're talking about maturity, Lance. I'll be curious to see. I've got just a few growers that planted some 4.3 beans.
Okay.
That when we did finally get some rain, they were still green as a gourd, top to bottom. So that's a little bit more on the extreme side of things. But I'll be curious. None of them have been cut yet.
Right. Well, here's the way it works in my mind. So here's our yield graph again. So here's that. Here's that early 3 chugging along there. Here's that 4.3 chugging along, and then the drought starts to affect it.
Yep.
And then you get the rain,
and where it ends up.
And where's it end up? Does this line cross that line? Does it get close to it? Does it go up but still nowhere near as good?
Absolutely.
Where's that going to be? Because right.
It still was hurt by drought. Yes.
Here is where those beans were headed for, which is a train wreck. Yeah. That rain added a lot of bushels, but if you'd already lost 20 and then you add back 10, you're still 10 in the hole. Yeah. And that it'll be interesting to see that's
a conversation I'd throw out there. Yep. Some of those customers I was talking about had those longer relative maturity beans. We're all sitting there scratching our heads, wondering where they're going to be.
Yeah. Well, and one thing we know for sure is they did benefit from those late rains, and
absolutely.
Whether it was a 5 bushel bump, a 10 bushel bump, a 15 bushel bump, I don't know. And we also don't know, how big of a hole were they in at the start. So we're kind of been talking about soybean yield. Let's switch over and talk to corn. Talk about corn. It's going to be a similar conversation, although things like planting date and maturity probably aren't as noticeable on the corn side. There's been some really good early corn. There's been some good full season corn. I would say really full season corn, you get up in that 117, 120 day stuff. That's kind of suffering, kind of like those full season beans probably did. 120 day corn needs a lot more rain in August than 110 day corn does. And if you didn't get any rain in August, that's going to put your 120 day corn hybrid under a lot more stress. Now there's some really good full season hybrids out there, some really elite genetics, and maybe they're able to power through that with some good drought tolerance and good genetics. But if you're, picking 113 day corn that was a pleasant surprise, and you're anxious with anticipation for how awesome your full season corn is going to be, and you dive into it and it's worse than your mid-season corn was, that's probably an August weather scenario. But the same list can be made for corn. So again, weather. Question, Adam?
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, Lance.
Yes.
I had a text question come in. It's a good question.
Yep. You can even interrupt me for bad questions. You know that old saying, they say there's no such thing as a dumb question. I've heard some. I've even asked some. So that's not true. There are dumb questions, but we stop even for those. But Adam says this is a good one.
So last year, we had a lot of quality issues, seed bean quality issues, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And the question came in whether these later rains might affect seed bean qualities. What we're hearing on seed bean qualities, generally speaking.
Yeah.
Maybe after coming off last year.
Yeah. So last year's quality issues were largely driven by about 8 to 10 inches of rain in October on beans that could have been harvested if we'd had time to get to them, probably in late September or early October. Ended up getting harvested in November because we got so much rain in October that they had to set there for a month. So a combination of setting and waiting and the moisture and the amount of moisture and the prolonged period of the moisture was really what drove those diseases that impacted quality last year. So our September rains, and even places that had a obnoxious amount of rain in September, those soybeans really weren't even completely done growing at that point yet. They hadn't really matured. They weren't ready to harvest. We just talked about how that was kind of a point in time kind of thing. We didn't have a prolonged period of wetness. At least we haven't yet. If it sets in raining, this week and rains for a month, then that would maybe cause some quality concerns. But I haven't heard any quality concerns coming out of the production team. I know yields have been, we raise soybeans the same way you guys do. So our yields have been similar to yours. We have a lot of production, from central Illinois south, which, might have better beans than central Illinois north does. So bean yields I've been hearing from production has been good. And I don't think there's really any quality concerns because of the rains that we had 3 weeks or so ago. Different scenario than last year. So if we go back to corn, the weather that I want to look at is obviously rainfall, but not just total amount. Pay close attention to timing and intensity of rainfall. And this is something I really like to use Climate Field View for. And we've talked before about how you can go look at your field weather history. So the historical weather for each field is in your black and orange, the app you can get on your phone, the app that you look at your weather in, not your, so this one that looks like that right there is where you want to go to get that. It's easiest to do it on your laptop or on your desktop on a computer screen. You can get to it on your phone or an iPad, but on the left-hand side of the margin, when you pull up a field, if you scroll down past your images, you'll come to a little box that says weather. Might say weather data, can't remember, but it'll say something about weather. You click on that. That's how you get to the daily rainfall amounts. If you've got planting data in your account, those rainfall totals start at planting. If you don't have planting data in your account, I believe it actually goes back to a calendar year. So it might go back to January 1. So if you don't have planting data in there, be careful. Now you can specify a date. So when you go in that historical data, you can pick a date. You can say, give me my rainfall from May 1st till today, or May 1st till August 1st, or July 1. If you want to look at monthly totals, you can say, how much rain did I get on this field month of July, month of August. So look at those monthly totals. Look at when in the month the rain came, and look at, did you get a 6-inch rain that 2/3 of it ran off and might have caused some ponding and might have caused some anaerobic soil conditions for a short time, and might have done as much harm as good. So some of these areas where, were you ideal moisture in May and June? Were you excessively wet in May and June? Or were you dry in May and June is going to have an influence on what happened to you in August. So you might have a farm that had 15 inches of rain during the growing season, but 10 of it was in May and June, and only 5 of it was in July and August. And that is really front loading your moisture, which doesn't work very well. Timely rains are better than getting an excessive amount early and hoping you can store it up. So I'm not big on storing moisture. It just doesn't work that good. I just want timely rain. Now, sometimes you can't get timely rain, and then maybe you'd have been better off to have some stored moisture. But if you've got stored moisture, that means you've had excessive moisture at some point in time, and excessive moisture can actually cause more damage than lack of moisture. And some of the yields we're seeing this year in corn in areas where people were pretty darn dry, and they're still raising 275 bushel corn, is a good illustration of the fact that these crops can do a lot with a lot less than normal amount of rainfall if it comes at the right time and in the right way.
Particularly when we have cool temperatures.
Yes.
During rainfall.
Yep. So you've got, I would say that coolness cannot make up for lack of moisture, but it does help. So your ideal grain fill weather, that sounds like a Bond movie or something.
Yeah. It sounds like a new Twitter hashtag.
Yeah, I'm all over Twitter. So your ideal grain fill would be good soil moisture, cool temps, especially nighttime, and sunshine. And if you're getting down to 80, 85 and bright sunshine during the day and 55 at night and good moisture and lots of bright sunshine, that's how you get 65,000 kernels equaling 56 pounds of corn. If these temps start to elevate on you, or the moisture starts to decrease on you, or the sunshine starts to go away, this number starts to go up. And as that number starts to go up, your yield does that. So we are absolutely seeing some huge kernel sizes and really heavy kernels in some of these yields, because nobody was telling me they're finding 20 by 44 ears. We're generally 16 by 35 ish. And 16 by 35, even if you got 35,000 of them, to get to 275, you got to have some pretty big kernels. And we get a tremendous amount of yield from kernel size and kernel depth. That is an often overlooked component of yield in corn. And what kernel size and kernel depth does for you is it lowers the number of kernels it takes to make 56 pounds of corn. And the lower you can drive that number with the help of good moisture, cool weather, sunshine, the higher you're going to drive your yield. Okay. So after rainfall distribution, temperature tends to be more uniform across the geographical area. Rainfall patterns are crazy variable. And it is absolutely frequently the case that this farm over here caught 4/10 of an inch of rain that this farm over here didn't get. Or maybe it was an inch, or maybe it was 7/10 or 8/10. And if you look at that and you go, well, there's only 4/10 difference. Well, if that 4/10 difference was the 30th of July or the 5th of August, that might be a 10 or 15 bushel difference in the performance of that hybrid just from that one relatively small rain. So that's why being able to look back at those daily totals and we could get in the weeds on an argument of how accurate is that data, because you all watch it when it comes in on your phone, right? And when it comes in on your phone, it says you had 1.5 inches and your gauge has got 3/4 in it. You go, oh, this thing's not worth anything. So two things about that. That 1.5 inches that climate's telling you, that is supposed to be for the average of the whole field. And nobody had 1,000 rain gauges in their field. So don't tell me what was in your rain gauge. The rain gauge is not the same as the field. And also, we go back with better data a couple days after the rainfall event and true up those rainfall totals that you'll see when you go look at the historical data. So if you took the time to track this, and there's probably somebody watching who's analytical enough to do this. I've never had anybody tell me they've done this. But if you write down every day what your phone says, and then you wait 72 hours and you go on the computer and you look at what that day's total is, it will often be slightly different than what the phone said. And that's that true up that happens. So we know the immediate results you get on your phone are not perfect. We know 72 hours later when we true it up online, it's not perfect, but it's closer to right. And it's better than a rain gauge underneath the tree in your front yard. I like climate. I haven't put a rain gauge out in 10 years probably. But I do use those field averages a lot. So after that, we've got, I would say, disease. It's going to come in here. Management. And again, I'm going to put genetics at the bottom. Adam's over here having a corn area. Lance, we're trying to sell seed, right? And that's genetics. So, but same thing again. What weather's going to drive everything. Weather is primarily rainfall. Adam made a good call out on temperatures. The diseases that we're primarily battling in corn would be crown rot, anthracnose. I'll put tar spot on the list, although not all of you have enough tar spot to matter. And I'm going to add ear molds to this too. So this is a little bit of a little more recent development that people have noticed. In some cases, there is a disappointing amount of diplodia in corn again, as well as a host of other. I work with a colleague of mine Rachel Willis, who's been on here with me before. Rachel's actually a trained pathologist. Most of us agronomists pretend occasionally to be pathologists when we're talking about diseases. Rachel actually is a pathologist. And she was mentioning the other day that she could do a clinic on ear rots and ear molds in a lot of fields with just the amount of crud that she's finding. Generally, it's at a low enough level that it's not really impacting what your grain's going to be worth at the elevator. But occasionally, in the case of diplodia, we have had some elevated levels. Diplodia is driven primarily by moisture and inoculum, which relates to rotation. So the worst situation for diplodia would be irrigated corn on corn. And if your corn on corn is no-till or strip-till, which I have seen some amazing strip-till corn on corn. It works great until diplodia blows you out of the water. If you're familiar with the game of Russian roulette, that's what that would be. So just be cautious, especially if you're irrigated. If you're irrigating no-till or strip-till corn on corn and you don't have diplodia problems, I would be shocked. That is really, really, really a challenging situation. And one of our sellers was asking me the other day, well, what hybrids can we recommend that won't get diplodia? AG38 XF1, AG35 XF1. Those aren't hybrids. That's not even corn. Those are soybeans. That would be the only corn I'm aware of that won't get diplodia. Would be a soybean. So there is no immunity to diplodia. Some are worse than others. We do our best to rate them, but you can't prevent it by hybrid selection. Now, maturity can influence it. So flowering date makes a difference. When diplodia is at its absolute worst, it's when you've got a lot of moisture at flowering. That's when you get a lot of bad shank infections. And when you get a shank infection, that's when you get that mummified ear, and the whole ear is just rotten crap. What we're seeing more this year, I think, is more what I would classify as a tip infection, where it's coming in from the tip of the ear through maybe an open husk, maybe some insect damage, maybe some bird damage, something exposed that tip to the spores that are floating around in the air. We got an infection there. I've seen some corn that, looking at the outside of the ear, looks okay, but it's got a rotten cob in it. And when you break that ear open, you can see that the cob is discolored. You can see the cob is soft. It's kind of rotten. And that kernel is kind of starting to rot from the cob out. So the outside part of it, you can see before you shell it, looks relatively okay. But once you shell it and you can see the side of the kernel, you can tell there's some discoloration there. It's, most of the weight is there in that case. There's not a tremendous amount of yield loss with that. And it takes a lot of that to make the grain sample look really, really bad. But, if you're getting up to, 15 or 20% bad ears, that's going to get you in a spot where, there might be some docks at the elevator, and that's when people get really frustrated with it. But, there are areas that have just historically, and I don't know what it is about the microclimate or, so, and a lot of it's management. I mean, it follows irrigation. So any place you see irrigation pivots, that's an area that's historically had more diplodia, because they're creating the right environment for it. And we do more corn on corn under irrigation because so few people really enjoy raising irrigated soybeans. So we do more corn on corn there. We've got the water. When Mother Nature helps you out with additional water on top of the water that you're pumping out through the pivot, that's when you get into scenarios. And we haven't had a bad diplodia year in several years, but you go back a few years. Yeah, Adam's knocking on wood back here. There was a year, I remember several years ago, that you were talking about Twitter. Farmers started their own contest online to see who had the highest damage sample going into the elevator, and those are not fun times. So I haven't seen anything approaching those levels this year, but I have seen a few isolated fields where it's bad enough somebody's going to notice, and somebody's going to need to either blend out some corn or take your lumps on a particular field, or maybe a few loads around the edge. So I forgot to mention that no matter how little or how much diplodia you see in a field, the outside 24 to 48 rows will be at an elevated level compared to the interior part of the field. So sometimes those you pull into a field, you make that first round along the edge, and you think, oh my God, this is a disaster. It's probably going to get better as you get into it. But you might need to be careful with how you handle those first few loads coming off the edge.
Yeah, we've been in pretty good shape in my territory for the most part on that subject. And I think for the team, for the most part, I think as you've gone east across the state, is that where you've seen or heard about more?
Yeah.
I think, what do they always say? Dry before silking, then 2 to 3 weeks after silking.
Yes, good call out. Yeah, there is some old research. When I say old, even older than Adam and I, it goes back like into the teens and 20s, that showed that a period of drought stress prior to pollination and then moisture through pollination was kind of what drove it the most. And that would be a pretty good description for the growing season that some parts of the state had.
Yeah. Not my part of the state, but some
Right.
parts.
Okay, so let's talk about, we mentioned phantom yield loss. This is a fun topic. It's a hotly debated topic amongst some people. Most of what I would call the best research that's been done on it has been done by some of our academic institutions. So I know Nebraska and Purdue have both published a fair amount of work. I think a lot of the major land grant universities have looked at it. So a quick Google search on phantom yield loss will probably take you to some academic research if you want to get really deep in the weeds. But I think phantom yield loss is first and foremost is a real thing. But in my world, it oftentimes gets confused or mistaken for or mixed up with what I call harvest loss. So if you had that scenario where you were picking 25% corn that was making 250, and you pull out of that field when it's half done, and you come back into that field a month later, and it's now 16.3, and it's making 220, and both of these figures are shrunk to 15% number 2 moisture. So that 30 bushel yield loss, where's my 30 bushel? That's what you want to know, right? So phantom yield loss is a component of the missing 30 bushel. But in addition to phantom yield loss, we've got dropped ears, we've got lodged stalks, we've got way more head shelling, and these yield differences most often come from a yield monitor. And I don't care how well calibrated you are, and I don't care how good your yield monitor is, you need 2 different calibrations for 16% corn and 25% corn. And even if you recalibrate, that's another difference versus when you were in it at 25%. So yield monitors measure flow and sort of mass, but not really weight so much. Now, there are a few on the market that are starting to combine weight with this, but the mass and the weight and the flow of 25% corn and 16.3% corn are vastly different. And so I'm going to argue in some cases this 30 bushel difference is not a true 30 bushel. Now, if you scale carded it, and we've done some of these trials, Chris Cowell did this several years ago. He does a lot more work than I do, Adam. It seems like all the time I'm referring to something that Chris did it because I didn't do it. So I got to talk about it. So anyway, all this stuff over here, I mean, it takes graduate students. That's why academia works on this stuff, because all you guys that tell me, well, there weren't any dropped ears, there weren't any large stalks, there's not much head shelling. Okay, did you actually go out and pick up all the residue, glean the field, pick up every dropped ear, pick up every lost kernel, pick up every split broken kernel, and weigh all that to find out how much of your missing yield was still laying in the field? I think back to my own harvest last fall when I had a lot of corn that was dropping ears and lodged stalks and falling apart, and we were hurrying to get it out of the field. I didn't think I was losing that much either until I went to control volunteer corn in my soybeans this summer. Holy crap, was there a lot of volunteer corn out there. So all that volunteer corn that was growing in our soybean fields this year is the majority of this 30 bushel difference. Now, phantom yield loss. And I'm not going to I'm not going to quote the research because I haven't looked it up as to what percentage. It's a very small number. I mean, when you look at when you read that stuff, you're going to see numbers that look like that, and numbers that look like that, and numbers that look like that, and fairly small percentages. But the reason that phantom yield loss occurs is because that kernel is a live organism, and live organisms go through respiration, and respiration takes energy, and energy, can slowly over time, the kernel respiring, it uses up a small, minute amount of itself to support its critical functions to maintain its viability as a seed. But that is very, 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 very minimal compared to harvest loss, which is that head shelling, dropped ears, lodge stalks. That's where most of it's coming from. So when somebody that doesn't have to pay your drying bill tells you that 23% is the optimal harvest moisture for corn, they're saying that because most physical yield loss occurs below 23%. So down to 23% is generally not lodge stalks. There's generally not dropped ears. The grain is hooked onto the cob hard enough that it's not shelling at the head very much. And and not that 21 or 22 is that much different than 23, but as you go on down, it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And when you pull into a field that's, and if it gets, heaven forbid, if it's 13%, then we're in a soybean scenario here where we're losing yield because we're missing water, because the yield is calculated at 15%. This is huge on soybeans. So if you want to talk about phantom yield loss on soybeans, there's a lot of 9% beans getting cut. So Adam, help me with the math here. 9% versus 13%. So let's say your soybeans made 70 at 9%. So what would they have been at 13%? And the way I do this math, I'll let Adam do it too, see if he comes up with the same number. That's 70 bushel beans at point. Not very good TV here this morning. So if you take the yield, that's 9%. So 1 minus moisture, 0.09, divided by 1 minus what the moisture would have been at 13. So do a little bit of algebra here. It's one thing I learned from a grains class in college was how to do shrink. So 1 minus 13% is 0.87. 1 minus 9% is 0.91. So if you were 70 point seven bushel times It's easier to do when people aren't watching now. Okay, so there's about 2.8. So on 70 bushel beans, by my math, they would have been 72.8 at 13. So you got about 3 bushel there difference just in, and that 2.8 bushel is nothing more than the weight of the water that's missing from 9% soybeans. And I don't know about your combine, but mine, they shatter way worse at 9% than they do at 13%. So you've got it's raining soybeans out there, right? Bouncing off the windshield, bouncing off the cutter bar, bouncing off the reel. I would say easily there's a couple bushel additional shatter loss. So I would say 9% beans versus 13% beans. There's an easy 5 bushel yield gap there. So those 70 bushel beans could have been 75 if we could have got them at 13%. Now, we can't do that consistently, and we can only do what we can do. So this is just going to happen. Things you can do to try to help the situation would be to plant a wider range of maturities of soybeans so that not every acre of beans you have is ready to cut at the same time. You can roll the dice and wait for a rain, which is really nice as long as it doesn't rain for a month. And you get in a scenario where you're trying to find days to cut beans in November, which sometimes can be hard to do. So you got to make that judgment call yourself. If you can, it's really hard to cut beans the first time they're 13%, because generally anymore, especially when they mature early, the kind of weather we've had the last 2 weeks has been perfect for tough cutting dry beans, because the grain dries so much faster than the healthy plant does. The other thing that influences harvestability of soybeans is plant health. So if you've got dead sticks out there, they cut really nice, but they're probably not yielding as good as those green stemmed ones are. The other thing that influences green stems is pod load. So if you have a plant that was headed for 90 bushel, ran into a drought, pulled back to 70 bushel through some seed and pod abortion, and then got a bunch of rain in September before it was completely mature, but no longer has that heavy pod load to feed, you've got a plant that might actually, soybeans typically we say are source limited. But if, so your sink is your seed, your source is the plant. So if half your seed died because it was going through some really tough conditions, and then all of a sudden conditions improve for the plant, soybeans can occasionally become sink limited if they've aborted enough seeds. And that's when you get green stems in some cases. So green stems can be related to good plant health and lack of disease, which is a good thing. They can also be related to low pod count, which is not a good thing. And what a green stem tells you is that's a plant that didn't die early. So generally, that's a positive thing. And I don't see a lot of 90 plus bushel soybeans that aren't kind of tough to cut. And I see a lot of 60 bushel beans that cut really nice. So generally speaking, if you're going to be shooting for 90 bushel beans, you're going to cut some tough beans. We've played around with some defold trials where we've tried to desiccate the soybean plant. And actually in some parts of the country, they do that with cotton routinely. Cotton has to be desiccated to be harvested. Some high yield soybean producers have experimented with that with soybeans as well. If you're creating an environment where soybeans are yielding 150, 160 bushel, you're probably going to need to desiccate that crop to get it harvested timely. and we've played around with some of the defol that's being used in seed corn production. Could we dry the plant out, basically wait till it's just reached its peak dry matter accumulation, so the bean would still have a lot of leaves at this point, and it's still going to have a lot of yellow in it at this point. Could we come in right when dry matter accumulation is done and basically dry the plant out so that you could harvest it timely and probably 2 to 3 weeks earlier than you would be able to harvest it through letting it dry down naturally? The tricky part is the timing on that, because in seed corn, we're really worried about the viability of the seed and the quality of the seed. We don't care about the size of the seed as much. Matter of fact, some of the defol work that seed companies are doing in corn is so we don't have 65 and 70 pound bag weights. They're trying to control seed size. But in soybeans and commercial production, seed size is a huge component of yield. So if you kill it a week too early, you're going to hurt your yield. So the timing is tricky. The labor involved in doing it is a challenge. We're not really accustomed to driving through soybeans at that time of season. You would either need some tram lines or some wide rows. You'd need beans that were still standing good, because if you're running over beans at that time, you're going to be losing a tremendous amount of yield driving. If you drive over them in the summertime, the beans around them can compensate. If you drive over them, so we'd probably be looking at, possibly aerial applications. So the logistics of making that work are a challenge, but it is fun to think about is, could we actually harvest beans, full season beans in, by Labor Day, because they're mature by Labor Day, but they're not ready to cut on Labor Day. So just something that we played around with. So anyway, we're over time. Any questions come in here towards the end, Adam?
Nope.
All right. So I did a bad job today. Did not stimulate a lot of questions, but appreciate
back on the 20th.
Appreciate you joining today. We'll be back on the 20th of October with another 2 weeks of harvest under our belt. Some of you will probably be done by then, unless the weather changes. And everybody stay safe. This is the most dangerous time of year on the farm, and don't want to hear about any tragedies. So everybody be safe, be careful, and we'll see you back in 2 weeks.